Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa stood on the bridge of the carrier Taiho and watched his pilots climb into their aircraft with the solemn pride of a father sending sons to glory. It was June 19th, 1944, the morning of what Japanese planners had designated Operation Eigo, and Ozawa commanded the most powerful carrier striking force Japan had assembled since Pearl Harbor. 9 carriers, 430 aircraft, the finest pilots the Imperial Japanese Navy could still field. The Americans awaited them near the Mariana Islands with 15 carriers of their own. The mathematics favored Japan, or so Ozawa believed. Japanese aircraft possessed superior range. Japanese pilots had been trained in the traditions of the samurai, imbued with fighting spirit that no American factory could manufacture. The enemy would be caught between Ozawa's carrier planes and land-based aircraft from Guam and Tinian, hammered from 2 directions, their numerical advantage negated by superior Japanese skill and determination. "Today we avenge Midway," Ozawa told his staff as the first strike wave launched into the Philippine Sea. "The Americans believe their numbers make them invincible. They will learn that numbers are nothing against the spirit of Yamato." His chief of staff, Rear Admiral Toshikazu Ohmai, nodded in agreement. Intelligence reports indicated that American pilot quality had declined significantly since 1942. The veterans who had fought at Coral Sea and Midway had been rotated home or promoted to desk positions. The men flying American fighters now were replacements. Boys fresh from abbreviated training programs rushed into cockpits to fill the insatiable demands of a 2-ocean war. Their pilots trained for 6 months, Ohmai observed. Ours trained for 2 years. Each of our aviators is worth 3 of theirs, perhaps more. The assessment was not propaganda, it was doctrine, supported by reports from surviving pilots who had encountered Americans over the Solomons and New Guinea. American flyers were brave but predictable, aggressive to the point of recklessness, dependent on their superior aircraft rather than superior skill. They attacked in rigid formations and broke off when seriously challenged. They lacked the sation, the spiritual force that transformed a pilot into a warrior. Ozawa permitted himself a thin smile as the last aircraft of the first wave disappeared toward the eastern horizon. 400 miles away, American carriers waited for an attack they could not stop. The pilots flying toward them were the inheritors of a tradition that stretched back to the first aerial samurai, men who had been selected from thousands of applicants, trained until flying was as natural as breathing, honed until their reflexes operated faster than conscious thought. What could American factory workers, given 6 months of instruction and a manual, do against such men? The answer came 8 hours later. Of the 373 aircraft Ozawa launched that day, 243 were destroyed, shot out of the sky by American pilots who were supposed to be inferior. 3 Japanese carriers were sunk. The operation that was meant to avenge Midway became a catastrophe so one-sided that American pilots gave it a name that would echo through history: the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. What Vice Admiral Ozawa did not know, what Japanese intelligence had catastrophically failed to understand, was that American pilot training had not declined since 1942. It had transformed. The boys in those cockpits were not poorly trained replacements. They were products of the most sophisticated aviation training system the world had ever seen. A system that took raw recruits and manufactured combat pilots with an efficiency that made Japanese training look medieval by comparison. The samurai spirit was real, but the Americans had built something that spirit alone could not defeat. They had built a machine that made pilots the way factories made aircraft, relentlessly, systematically, and in numbers that would darken the sky over Japan itself. Japanese confidence in their pilot superiority was not delusion. It was history written in burning American warships. On December 7th, 1941, Japanese naval aviators had executed the most devastating aerial attack in military history. They had flown 353 aircraft across 230 miles of open ocean, arrived over Pearl Harbor at precisely 7:48 a.m., and proceeded to destroy the American Pacific Fleet in 2 hours. 8 battleships sunk or damaged, 3 cruisers wrecked, 3 destroyers demolished, 188 aircraft destroyed on the ground, 2,400 Americans dead. Japanese losses, 29 aircraft, 65 men. The exchange ratio was almost incomprehensible, a testament to years of training that had produced aviators of extraordinary skill. The pilots who attacked Pearl Harbor had logged an average of 800 flight hours before the war began. Many had over 1,000 hours. Some, like Lieutenant Commander Mitsuo Fuchida, who led the first wave, had been flying combat missions over China since 1937. These were not merely skilled pilots. They were artists of aerial warfare, selected through a process so rigorous that only 1 in 1,500 applicants earned their wings. The Yokrin program, the Imperial Navy's flight training system, began with a pool of teenage candidates who had already demonstrated exceptional physical fitness, academic achievement, and what instructors called tamashi, the indefinable quality of warrior spirit. These candidates endured 3 years of instruction that combined academic study, physical conditioning, and flight training into an ordeal designed to eliminate anyone who fell short of perfection. The philosophy was simple. A pilot who required 1,000 hours of training to reach competence would eventually become, with enough practice, a pilot worth 10 lesser aviators. Quality would always defeat quantity. The samurai sword, folded 1,000 times by a master craftsman, would always cut through inferior steel. This philosophy had been validated in every engagement of the Pacific War's first year. At the Battle of the Java Sea in February 1942, Japanese aviators sank 5 Allied warships while losing a single aircraft. In the Indian Ocean raids of April 1942, they devastated the British Eastern Fleet, sinking a carrier, 2 cruisers, and 23 merchant ships at a cost of 18 planes. Over the skies of Darwin, Port Moresby, and Rabaul, Japanese pilots established an air superiority so complete that Allied forces operated in perpetual fear of attack. Commander Minoru Genda, the tactical genius who had planned Pearl Harbor, articulated the doctrine in a 1942 lecture to naval staff officers. The Americans possess greater industrial capacity than Japan. They will build more aircraft than we can build. This is a mathematical certainty we cannot change. What we can change is the exchange ratio. If our pilots are trained until each one is worth 5 American pilots, then their numerical advantage becomes meaningless. We will shoot down 5 of their aircraft for every one of ours they destroy. Their factories cannot keep pace with such losses. Their population will not tolerate such casualties. Quality is our strategy. Training is our weapon. The strategy appeared to be working. American pilots in 1942 were demonstrably inferior to their Japanese counterparts. They flew aggressive but uncoordinated attacks. They broke formation under pressure. They failed to exploit advantages and compounded small mistakes into catastrophic losses. At the Battle of Midway, ostensibly an American victory, the torpedo bomber squadrons were slaughtered almost to the last man, their attacks so poorly coordinated that Japanese fighters picked them off like target drones. Japanese intelligence studied these engagements and drew logical conclusions. Captain Rikihei Inoguchi of the Naval General Staff compiled a comprehensive assessment of American pilot capabilities in early 1943. His report, circulated to fleet commanders throughout the Pacific, established the assumptions that would govern Japanese planning for the next 2 years. American pilot training emphasizes speed over thoroughness. Their aviators receive approximately 6 months of instruction before deployment to combat units, compared to 2 years for Imperial Navy pilots. This abbreviated training produces pilots capable of basic flight operations, but lacking the refined skills necessary for complex aerial combat. They compensate with numerical superiority and aggressive tactics, but aggression without precision creates vulnerability. Our pilots consistently report that American formations break down under sustained pressure. Individual American pilots, when separated from their formations, demonstrate poor judgment and limited maneuvering skills. The conclusion is evident. In pilot versus pilot engagements, where numbers are equalized, Japanese aviators will prevail decisively. The assessment was accurate for 1943. What Inoguchi did not know, what Genda had not anticipated, what Ozawa would discover too late over the Philippine Sea, was that American pilot training was undergoing a transformation so comprehensive that the aviators of 1944 would bear almost no resemblance to the aviators of 1942. The Americans were not training pilots faster because they had lowered their standards. They were training pilots faster because they had reinvented the very concept of how pilots were made. And by the time Japan recognized what was happening, the skies over the Pacific would belong to a new generation of American aviators, men whose training had been compressed not by necessity, but by design, and whose skills would prove that the samurai philosophy of endless refinement was not the only path to mastery. There was another path. The Americans had found it. The revolution began in a conference room in Pensacola, Florida, in March 1942, when a naval aviator named John S. McCain Sr. asked a question that no one wanted to answer. How many pilots did we lose last month? The staff officers around the table shifted uncomfortably. The numbers were classified, but everyone in the room knew them anyway. 47 pilots killed in training accidents. 23 more dead in combat, 62 aircraft destroyed before they ever fired a shot at the enemy. McCain, commanding the Navy's air training program, pressed harder. And how many did we graduate? 89, sir. So we're losing pilots faster than we're making them. No one contradicted him. The mathematics were undeniable. The pre-war training system, designed to produce a small number of highly polished aviators for a peacetime fleet, was collapsing under the demands of global war. The Navy needed thousands of pilots. The training pipeline was producing hundreds, and the pipeline itself was killing nearly as many men as the Japanese. McCain had been a naval aviator since 1936. He understood the culture he was fighting against, a culture that prized individual excellence, that measured a pilot's worth by his hours in the cockpit, that believed shortcuts in training meant shortcuts in combat. The admirals who had built the Navy's air arm believed, like their Japanese counterparts, that pilot quality was paramount. Better to have 100 superb pilots than 1,000 mediocre ones. McCain believed something different. We're not fighting the last war, he told his staff that morning. We're fighting this war, and this war will be won by the side that puts more pilots in the sky, not the side that trains each pilot longer. The Japanese have better pilots than we do right now. They won't have better pilots than we do in 2 years. Because in 2 years, we're going to have 10 pilots for every one of theirs. And I don't care how good their pilots are. 10-to-1 wins every time. The statement was heresy in an institution that had spent 2 decades worshiping at the altar of individual excellence. But McCain had allies. Men who understood that industrial warfare required industrial thinking, and that training pilots was a manufacturing problem as much as an educational one. Lieutenant Commander James Flatley was one of those allies. A combat veteran who had faced Japanese pilots over the Coral Sea, Flatley possessed credibility that desk-bound theorists could not claim. He had seen the enemy's skill firsthand. He had also seen something else: patterns. The Japanese are predictable, Flatley reported in a May 1942 briefing. They execute textbook maneuvers with extraordinary precision. Their training has made them technically flawless. But technical perfection is not the same as tactical intelligence. When we do something unexpected, when we break from the patterns they've been trained to counter, they hesitate. Their responses are learned, not intuited. If we can train our pilots to recognize these patterns and exploit them, we can neutralize Japanese experience with American adaptability. The insight was revolutionary. Japanese training produced pilots who could execute any maneuver perfectly. American training would produce pilots who could recognize which maneuver to execute, and more importantly, which maneuver to expect from the enemy. The result was a complete redesign of naval aviation training. The old system had followed the Japanese model: long hours of flight time, gradual progression from basic to advanced skills, emphasis on individual mastery. A pilot graduated when his instructor judged him ready, which might take 18 months or 3 years depending on the candidate. The new system operated on different principles entirely. First, standardization. Every training squadron would follow the same curriculum, use the same evaluation criteria, and apply the same standards. A pilot graduating from Pensacola would possess exactly the same skills as a pilot graduating from Corpus Christi. Individual instructor preferences were eliminated in favor of systematic, measurable competencies. Second, specialization. The old system had trained generalist pilots who were expected to master every aspect of aviation. The new system trained specialists, fighter pilots, dive bomber pilots, torpedo bomber pilots, each curriculum optimized for specific combat roles. A fighter pilot spent his training hours on fighter tactics, not on bombing runs. He would never fly in combat. Third, simulation. The Navy invested heavily in ground-based training devices, the Link Trainer and its successors, that allowed pilots to practice instrument flying, combat maneuvers, and emergency procedures without consuming flight time or risking aircraft. A pilot could fly 4 hours in a simulator and 2 hours in an actual aircraft, compressing 8 hours of old-style training into a single day. Fourth, combat intelligence integration. Training curricula were continuously updated based on reports from the Pacific. When a new Japanese tactic was identified, counter-tactics were developed and incorporated into training within weeks. Pilots arrived in combat squadrons, already knowing how the enemy would fight, because their instructors had studied the enemy's patterns and built training around defeating them. The transformation happened with a speed that would have been impossible in any nation less industrially capable than the United States. New training bases opened across Florida, Texas, and California. Civilian flight schools were absorbed into the military pipeline. Their instructors retrained in Navy methods. Aircraft production, which had seemed impossibly slow in 1941, accelerated to match the demand for training platforms. By mid-1943, the Navy was graduating over 2,500 pilots per month, more in 30 days than Japan would produce in a year. But the numbers alone did not capture the transformation. The pilots themselves were different. Ensign Alexander Vraciu joined Fighter Squadron 6 in late 1943 after completing the new training program. He had logged 350 flight hours, less than half what a Japanese pilot would have accumulated before entering combat. By traditional measures, he was undertrained. By the standards of modern warfare, he was a weapon precisely calibrated for the fight ahead. They taught us patterns, Vraciu recalled years later. Japanese patterns. How they approached, how they broke, how they reacted when you did this instead of that. By the time I saw my first Zero, I felt like I'd already fought him 100 times. I knew what he was going to do before he did it. The training had put his playbook in my head. Vraciu would become the Navy's 4th highest scoring ace of the war, with 19 confirmed kills. On June 19, 1944, the day Vice Admiral Ozawa launched his grand attack, Vraciu would shoot down 6 Japanese aircraft in a single mission, accounting for more than 2% of Japan's losses in what history would call the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. He was not exceptional, he was typical. The American training machine had not produced a handful of aces to match Japanese excellence. It had produced thousands of pilots, each one equipped with the knowledge and skills to defeat enemies who had spent years mastering techniques that American intelligence had already decoded. The samurai had trained for a lifetime to forge a single perfect sword. The Americans had built a factory that produced swords by the thousand and taught every swordsman exactly where the samurai armor was weakest. The factory nearly broke before it could run. In the first 6 months of the accelerated training program, the Navy lost more pilots to accidents than to Japanese fighters. The statistics were horrifying. 264 training deaths between June and December 1942, most of them in aircraft that never left American airspace. Cadets drowned when their planes ditched in the Gulf of Mexico. They died in mid-air collisions over Florida cow pastures. They flew into the ground during night exercises. Their instruments misread. Their instructors' warnings unheard. The old guard seized on these numbers as vindication. Rear Admiral John Towers, chief of the Bureau of Aeronautics and a pioneer of naval aviation since 1911, wrote a scathing memorandum to the Chief of Naval Operations in October 1942. The accelerated training program is producing pilots who cannot fly. They graduate with theoretical knowledge and die with practical ignorance. We are not training aviators. We are manufacturing casualties. Every pilot killed in training is a pilot who might have killed Japanese in combat. Every aircraft destroyed in Florida is an aircraft that might have defended our carriers. I urge immediate reconsideration of this misguided experiment before we have trained ourselves into defeat. Towers was not wrong about the casualties. He was wrong about the cause. The accidents were not the result of training too fast. They were the result of training too many, too quickly, with infrastructure that had not yet scaled to match the ambition. Instructors were overworked, some flying 8 training sorties per day, exhausted men teaching exhausted students techniques that required precision neither could muster. Aircraft maintenance lagged behind flight hours, sending cadets aloft in machines that should have been grounded. Base facilities, designed for peacetime throughput, strained under 10 times the designed capacity. But McCain and his allies refused to slow down. Instead, they accelerated differently. New training bases opened across the southern United States, Corpus Christi, Jacksonville, Miami, New Orleans, dispersing the student population and reducing the burden on individual facilities. Maintenance crews were expanded and retrained. Instructor rotations were formalized, ensuring that no pilot flew more than 5 training sorties in a day. Safety protocols, written in the blood of dead cadets, became mandatory rather than advisory. The accident rate dropped, the graduation rate climbed, and by early 1943, the factory was beginning to function. But the combat results remained discouraging. The Solomons Campaign, which dragged through the second half of 1942 and into 1943, provided the first large-scale test of American pilot training against Japanese opposition. The results, by any honest assessment, were mixed at best. Over Guadalcanal, American pilots fought with desperate courage and died in appalling numbers. The Cactus Air Force, the motley collection of Marine and Navy squadrons operating from Henderson Field, lost 101 aircraft in the first 2 months of the campaign, many of them to Japanese pilots who outflew them in nearly every engagement. The kill ratios favored Japan, sometimes dramatically. In the air battles of October 1942, Japanese fighters shot down American aircraft at a rate that approached 3 to 1. Lieutenant Commander John Smith, commanding Marine Fighter Squadron 223, reported the grim reality without embellishment. "Our boys are brave. They attack without hesitation, but the Japs are better. They see things we don't see. They react faster than we react. When we get into a turning fight, we lose. When we try to dive away, they follow. Our only advantage is numbers, and even that doesn't always help when their pilots can kill 2 or 3 of ours before we get one of them." Japanese intelligence monitored these engagements with satisfaction. The reports filtering back to Tokyo confirmed pre-war assumptions. American pilots were aggressive but unskilled, brave but predictable, numerous but inferior. The accelerated training program the Americans had implemented was clearly producing exactly the kind of half-trained aviators that Commander Genda had predicted, men who could fly but could not fight, who filled cockpits but emptied them just as quickly. Lieutenant Commander Tadashi Nakajima, a fighter ace with 11 kills who served as an instructor at Tainan Air Group, compiled an assessment for Naval General Staff in February 1943 that dripped with contempt. American pilot quality continues to decline as their training period shortens. Prisoners and captured documents confirm that enemy pilots now receive as little as 6 months of instruction before combat deployment. This haste produces aviators who understand basic aircraft handling but lack the refined skills necessary for aerial combat. They cannot sustain high-G maneuvers. They lose situational awareness in complex engagements. They panic when separated from their formations. Our pilots report that killing Americans has become routine. One senior aviator compared it to shooting at towed targets. If the Americans believe quantity can substitute for quality, they have fundamentally misunderstood the nature of aerial warfare. Nakajima's assessment was forwarded to Vice Admiral Ozawa, who filed it with the intelligence reports that would inform his planning for Operation Ego. The document reinforced everything the Japanese naval establishment believed. American training was a failure, American pilots were inferior, and Japanese quality would ultimately prevail against American quantity. Within the American training establishment, doubts festered as well. Instructors who watched their graduates ship out to the Pacific read the casualty reports with private anguish. Were they sending men to die? Were the accelerated methods producing pilots who looked competent in training environments but fell apart under combat stress? The accident rate had dropped, but the combat loss rate remained stubbornly high. Ensign Robert Duncan graduated from the accelerated program in March 1943 and joined Fighter Squadron 9 aboard the carrier Essex. In a letter to his former instructor, written after his first combat mission, he expressed the uncertainty that many new pilots felt. "They told us we were ready. I don't feel ready. The Zero came out of nowhere and I froze. Just for a second, but that second almost killed me. My wingman saved my life. In training, everything was ordered. Here, everything is chaos. I'm not sure the classroom prepared us for this. I'm not sure anything could." Duncan survived his first mission. Many of his classmates did not. The accelerated training program was producing pilots faster than ever before. Whether it was producing pilots capable of defeating Japan's elite aviators remained an open question through the dark months of 1943. The answer would come soon enough. But first, the factory needed one more refinement, a breakthrough that would transform theoretical knowledge into instinctive skill and turn 6 months of training into the equivalent of 6 years. The answer was already being developed in a classified facility in San Diego. Its name was the Fleet Air Gunnery Unit, and it would change everything. June 19th, 1944, the Philippine Sea. The morning the factory proved it worked. Lieutenant Junior Grade Wilbur Spider Webb sat in the cockpit of his F-6F Hellcat at 24,000 feet and listened to the radio chatter that told him death was coming from the west. Tally-ho! Bogies bearing 270, range 50 miles, estimate 50-plus aircraft, Angels 18. This is going to be a big one, boys. Webb acknowledged the call and checked his instruments with the calm precision that 10 weeks at the Fleet Air Gunnery Unit had drilled into his reflexes. Fuel adequate, ammunition full, oxygen flowing, wingman in position, everything was as it should be. Everything was as he had practiced 100 times in the skies over San Diego. The Fleet Air Gunnery Unit, soon to be renamed the Navy Fighter Weapons School and decades later immortalized as Top Gun, had been established in 1943 with a single purpose: to transform competent pilots into killers. The accelerated training program produced aviators who could fly. The gunnery unit taught them to fight. The curriculum was built on a foundation of captured intelligence and combat experience. Instructors studied every gun camera frame from Pacific engagements. They interviewed returning aces about Japanese tactics. They analyzed the Zero's performance envelope until they could predict its behavior in any situation. And then they taught their students to exploit every weakness they had discovered. The Zero can outturn you at low speed, Webb's instructor had explained during his first week at the unit. So don't fight at low speed. The Zero can outclimb you below 10,000 feet. So don't climb below 10,000 feet. The Zero pilot expects you to do what American pilots have always done: engage in honorable turning combat where his skills give him the advantage. So don't be honorable. Be effective. Dive on him from above. Make one pass. If you miss, extend and climb. Never, never get into a turning fight. You will lose that fight. You will die in that fight. Your job is not to fight fair. Your job is to kill him before he knows you're there. The training had been brutal, exhausting, and revelatory. Webb had arrived at the gunnery unit believing he knew how to fly a fighter. He departed understanding that flying and fighting were entirely different skills, and that the Americans had finally learned how to teach both. Now, 40 miles from the largest Japanese carrier strike since Pearl Harbor, he would discover whether the lessons held. All fighters, this is strike lead. Engage at will. Good hunting. Webb pushed his Hellcat into a shallow dive, building speed as he descended toward the approaching Japanese formation. His wingman, Ensign Harold Vida, held position 300 feet to his right. Ahead, the sky was filling with aircraft, Zeros, Judys, Jills, Kates, a swarm of Japanese planes that outnumbered the defending Americans by nearly 2 to 1. The numbers didn't matter. Webb had been taught why they didn't matter. Japanese formations were rigid, predictable. They flew in patterns that their training had burned into their reflexes, patterns that American intelligence had decoded and American instructors had taught their students to destroy. The Zeros would fly top cover in 3 plane sections. The bombers would hold formation until attacked, then scatter according to doctrine. Every response was scripted. Every script had a counter. Webb picked his target, a Zero at the trailing edge of the fighter screen, separated from his section by 100 yards of empty sky. The Japanese pilot was looking forward, watching for threats from the American carriers, not from the American fighters diving out of the sun behind him. One pass. Webb's 6.50 caliber machine guns fired for less than 2 seconds. 150 rounds tore through the Zero's engine compartment and cockpit. The aircraft didn't explode. It simply stopped flying, rolling into a flat spin from which no pilot could recover. Webb didn't watch it fall. He was already climbing, extending away from the engagement, building altitude for another pass. Behind him, Vita's guns were hammering another Zero that had turned to pursue, turned exactly as American instructors had said Japanese pilots would turn, presenting exactly the angle that American gunnery training had taught students to exploit. The second Zero fell in flames. 30 seconds, 2 kills, 0 damage to either American aircraft. Across the sky, the pattern repeated. American Hellcats dove through the Japanese formation in pairs and divisions, each pass calculated for maximum lethality and minimum exposure. They didn't dogfight. They didn't engage in the swirling, individualistic combat that Japanese pilots had trained for their entire careers. They slashed through the enemy formation like razors through silk, climbed away before the Japanese could react, and dove again from angles the enemy couldn't predict. Lieutenant Junior Grade Alexander Vratsiu, the graduate of the new training system who would become the day's highest scorer, found himself in the middle of a Judy dive bomber formation and simply stopped thinking. His body did what 10 weeks of intensive training had programmed it to do. First target, deflection shot, 2 o'clock low, lead the nose, squeeze the trigger, watch the rounds walk into the engine, kill. Second target, head-on approach, closing speed 600 miles per hour. 1 second to aim, 1 second to fire. The Judy disintegrated. Third target, pursuing from 6 o'clock. The easiest shot in aerial combat. The Japanese pilot never saw him coming. Fourth, fifth, sixth, the kills blurred together. Each engagement lasted seconds. Each Japanese pilot died before he could apply the years of training that was supposed to make him invincible. Vratsiu landed aboard the Lexington with his 6 kills and held up 6 fingers for the photographers who were already gathering on the flight deck. The image would become famous. A young American aviator, 25 years old, grinning with the casual confidence of a man who had discovered that the enemy was not as fearsome as advertised. But Vratsiu was not the story. He was merely a data point. The story was the numbers. Of the 373 aircraft Vice Admiral Ozawa launched that day, 243 were destroyed. Some fell to anti-aircraft fire from the American fleet. Some were shot down by combat air patrols on the return flight. Most, the overwhelming majority, were destroyed by American pilots flying the tactics developed at the Fleet Air Gunnery Unit, executing the doctrine perfected in the training revolution of 1943. American losses, 23 aircraft, most of those to anti-aircraft fire and accidents, not to Japanese fighters. The exchange ratio was approximately 10 to 1. 10 Japanese pilots, each with an average of 2 years of training, each heir to the traditions that had made the Imperial Navy's air arm the finest in the Pacific, died for every American pilot lost. The mathematics that Commander Genda had proposed in 1942 had been inverted. Quality had not defeated quantity. American quantity, combined with American training innovation, had annihilated Japanese quality in a single afternoon. Commander Akira Sasaki flew a Zero in the third wave of Ozawa's attack. He was a 12-year veteran with over 2,000 flight hours and 8 confirmed kills, exactly the kind of pilot Japanese doctrine insisted was worth 5 Americans. He survived the mission, barely. They were everywhere, Sasaki reported to his debriefing officer that evening, his hands still trembling from the engagement. They dove on us from above. We turned to engage, and they were gone, climbing away before we could bring guns to bear. When we tried to pursue, more came from different angles. It was not combat, it was execution. They knew exactly what we would do. They had planned for everything. Our formations broke apart in minutes. Men I had flown with for years died without firing a shot. I have never seen Americans fight like this. I do not understand how they learned. The debriefing officer had no answer. Neither did Vice Admiral Ozawa, who learned the scale of the disaster as his surviving pilots struggled back to carriers that would not survive the week. The samurai had met the factory's products in open battle. The factory had won. The Philippine Sea was not an ending, it was a beginning. In the 12 months that followed the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, the American pilot training machine produced results so devastating that Japanese commanders stopped believing their own intelligence reports. The numbers seemed impossible. They were not impossible. They were simply the output of a system operating at full capacity against an enemy that had never imagined such a system could exist. Between June 1944 and August 1945, American pilots shot down approximately 8,000 Japanese aircraft in aerial combat. Japanese pilots shot down fewer than 1,200 Americans. The exchange ratio across the final year of the war averaged better than 6-1, and in many engagements, it exceeded 15-1 or 20-1. The Japanese had no answer. Their training system, designed to produce elite aviators through years of intensive instruction, could not replace losses on this scale. A pilot who required 2 years to train and died in his first combat could not be replaced by another pilot who required 2 years to train. The mathematics were inexorable. Every month, Japan's pool of experienced aviators shrank. Every month, the men sent to replace them were younger, greener, less prepared for what awaited them. By late 1944, Japanese pilot training had collapsed into a grim parody of what it had once been. The 2-year program was compressed to 1 year, then to 6 months. Cadets who would have been rejected in 1941 were rushed through abbreviated curricula and sent to face American pilots who had been specifically trained to kill them. Lieutenant Saburo Sakai, Japan's greatest surviving ace with 64 confirmed victories, observed the decline with horror he could not express to his superiors. The new pilots arrived at Iwo Jima in November 1944. Boys, most of them, 19, 20 years old. They had perhaps 150 hours of flight time. They had never practiced aerial gunnery against moving targets. They had never flown in formation under combat conditions. I watched them take off for their first mission, and I knew with absolute certainty that most of them would not return. They were not pilots. They were offerings. We were feeding them to the Americans because we had nothing else to feed. The offerings died on schedule. Over Iwo Jima, over Okinawa, over the Philippines, the pattern repeated with mechanical regularity. Japanese formations rose to intercept American strikes. American pilots, executing tactics refined through 2 years of combat integration, tore the formations apart. Japanese pilots who survived the first pass scattered and died individually. Japanese pilots who held formation died collectively. The kill ratios at specific engagements defied belief. On October 24, 1944, during the air battles surrounding Leyte Gulf, American carrier pilots intercepted a Japanese strike force of 60 aircraft. In 18 minutes of combat, they destroyed 51, a kill ratio of approximately 12-1. The American squadron that achieved most of these kills lost 1 pilot, who was rescued from the water an hour later. On January 12, 1945, American fighters covering strikes against Formosa encountered over 100 Japanese interceptors. The engagement lasted 40 minutes. When it ended, 73 Japanese aircraft had been destroyed. American losses: 4 planes, 2 pilots. On April 6, 1945, the first day of the mass kamikaze offensive against the Okinawa invasion fleet, American combat air patrols shot down 248 Japanese aircraft in a single day. The kills came so fast that pilots ran out of ammunition and had to return to their carriers to rearm, sometimes twice in a single afternoon. Ensign Willis Hardy of Fighter Squadron 17 described that day's flying in a letter to his parents that was never censored because nothing in it revealed information the enemy did not already know. I shot down 5 today. 5. In training, they told us that most pilots never shoot down anything, that an ace, 5 kills, was rare. I got 5 in one afternoon. Everyone did. There were so many Japs in the sky we couldn't miss. They flew straight at the fleet, not maneuvering, not evading, easy targets. One of them flew right past my nose, so close I could see the pilot's face. He was looking at me like he'd never seen a Hellcat before. Maybe he hadn't. I put a burst into his engine and he went down burning. It didn't feel like combat. It felt like murder. But they would have killed our sailors if we'd let them through. So we didn't let them through. The letter captured something the official reports obscured: the psychological dimension of the slaughter. American pilots in the final year of the war were not fighting skilled opponents in desperate combat. They were executing undertrained boys who had been sent to die by commanders who had run out of alternatives. The samurai spirit that had once made Japanese aviators fearsome had been replaced by something closer to mass suicide. Waves of young men flying toward certain death because their training had not given them the skills to survive. Vice Admiral Matome Ugaki, commander of the 5th Air Fleet and architect of the Kamikaze Offensive, recognized the reality in his diary entry of April 15, 1945. Our pilots cannot compete with the Americans in conventional combat. This is no longer a matter of debate. The training differential has become insurmountable. An American pilot with 6 months of instruction now defeats our pilots with 12 months of instruction. Their system produces competence faster than ours produces excellence. We chose quality over quantity and discovered that American quantity came with quality we did not anticipate. The Special Attack Forces are our only remaining option, not because they are effective, but because conventional attacks have become impossible. We send our young men to die as missiles because we can no longer teach them to fight as pilots. The diary was captured at the end of the war. Ugaki did not survive to see it published. On August 15th, 1945, hours after the Emperor announced Japan's surrender, he climbed into a dive bomber and flew toward Okinawa on a final kamikaze mission. His plane was never found. His death was a fitting epitaph for the doctrine he had served, a doctrine that had bet everything on individual excellence and lost to systematic competence. The training revolution had not merely produced more pilots. It had produced better pilots, faster, through methods that Japanese military culture could not have conceived and could not have implemented even if conceived. The Americans had industrialized skill itself, transforming the ineffable qualities that made a fighter pilot effective into a curriculum that could be taught, measured, and reproduced at scale. Commander Minoru Genda, the architect of Pearl Harbor, the man who had promised that quality would defeat quantity, survived the war and lived until 1989. In a 1974 interview with an American military historian, he was asked where Japan's air strategy had gone wrong. His answer was one word: training. He elaborated reluctantly, as if the admission still caused pain after 3 decades. We believed that training was a matter of time. More hours produced better pilots. This was our doctrine since the beginning of naval aviation. The Americans proved that training was a matter of method. They discovered how to compress years of experience into months of instruction. They studied our tactics and taught their pilots to counter them before their pilots ever faced combat. When we met them in battle, they already knew us. We were fighting opponents who had rehearsed our deaths in their training exercises. This was not something we anticipated. This was not something we could answer. By the time we understood what they had built, our best pilots were dead, and our training system was producing boys who died within weeks of reaching their squadrons. The interviewer asked if Japan could have developed a similar training system. Genda shook his head. It was not a matter of capability. It was a matter of philosophy. We believed the pilot was an artist, a warrior whose skills could only be honed through endless practice, whose spirit could not be manufactured. The Americans believed the pilot was a technician, a professional whose skills could be analyzed, standardized, and transmitted. They were right. We were wrong. The war proved which philosophy produces victory. Spirit does not stop bullets. Training does. The bullets had stopped coming by August 1945. But the lesson remained, written in the wreckage of 8,000 Japanese aircraft and the bodies of 12,000 Japanese aviators who had been taught that their spirit would make them invincible. It had not. Nothing could make them invincible against a system designed to make invincibility irrelevant. The numbers required no interpretation. They simply were. Between December 1941 and August 1945, the United States Navy trained 60,747 pilots, more aviators in 4 years than Japan had trained in the previous 2 decades combined. The Army Air Forces trained an additional 193,440. Together, the American military produced 250,000 combat pilots during the war, each one processed through a system designed for efficiency rather than artistry. Japan trained approximately 24,000 pilots during the same period. Most of them died. The exchange ratios told the story in starker terms. In 1942, Japanese pilots shot down American aircraft at a rate of approximately 2 to 1. 2 American planes for every Japanese plane lost. This was the era of Japanese superiority, of samurai spirit ascendant, of American pilots dying in burning Wildcats over Guadalcanal. By 1944, the ratio had inverted to 6 to 1 in American favor. By 1945, it exceeded 12 to 1. In some engagements, it reached 20 to 1 or higher, numbers so lopsided that Japanese commanders suspected their pilots were lying about combat losses. They were not lying. They were dying. The post-war interrogations of surviving Japanese officers revealed a military establishment that had watched its foundational assumptions collapse and still could not understand how. Captain Rikihei Inoguchi, the intelligence officer who had dismissed American training as inadequate in 1943, was captured on Luzon in 1945 and subjected to extensive debriefing. His interrogation transcripts filled 300 pages. On page 217, the American interviewer asked him to assess where Japanese intelligence had failed. "We failed everywhere," Inoguchi replied, his voice flat with exhaustion. "But our greatest failure was in understanding your training system. We knew you were producing pilots quickly. We interpreted this as proof of inadequacy, rushed training producing inferior aviators. We did not understand that you had redesigned training itself. You did not compress our methods into a shorter time. You invented new methods that achieved better results in less time. This distinction seems obvious now. It was invisible to us then." The interviewer asked why Japanese intelligence had not detected the American training revolution. "Because we did not believe it was possible," Inoguchi said. "Our training doctrine was built on the assumption that pilot skill required years to develop, that there were no shortcuts, no efficiencies, no substitutes for time in the cockpit. When we heard that American pilots trained for 6 months, we assumed they were receiving 6 months of our training. We did not consider that they might be receiving something entirely different, something better." He paused, then added quietly, "We lost the war in our training schools. By the time our pilots met yours in combat, the outcome was already determined. Your pilots knew what ours would do. Your pilots had practiced killing ours before they ever left California. The battle was decided in the classroom. We simply did not realize it until the classroom's graduates started shooting us down." Similar admissions accumulated across the post-war years. Commander Masatake Okumiya, who had served as air staff officer to Vice Admiral Ozawa during the Philippine Sea disaster, wrote a detailed analysis of Japanese naval aviation failures that was published in 1956. The section on American training consumed 3 chapters. "We believed that the spirit of the warrior could not be manufactured. We believed that courage, determination, and skill required years of cultivation, that a pilot forged quickly would break quickly under combat stress. The Americans demonstrated that we were wrong on every count. Their pilots showed courage equal to ours. Their pilots showed skill superior to ours. And they produced these pilots in months rather than years, which meant they could replace losses while we could not." Okumiya described attending a post-war briefing in 1946 where American training methods were explained to Japanese military officers. "They showed us their curricula, their simulation systems, their combat intelligence integration, their emphasis on specific enemy tactics rather than general flying skills. Everything was designed for efficiency, for producing the specific competencies needed for combat in the minimum possible time. Our system produced pilots who could do anything adequately. Their system produced pilots who could do one thing: kill Japanese aircraft superbly. In war, specialists defeat generalists. We trained generalists. They trained killers. The testimony of Japanese pilots who survived the war carried its own devastating weight. Lieutenant Commander Takeo Tanamizu was one of Japan's highest-scoring aces, credited with over 30 victories. He survived the war despite flying combat missions until the final days, a feat that made him one of perhaps 200 Japanese naval aviators from the Pearl Harbor era to live until 1946. In a 1984 interview with a Japanese aviation magazine, Tanamizu reflected on what he had witnessed. "I flew against Americans from 1942 until 1945. I watched them change. In 1942, they were brave but clumsy. They made mistakes that cost them their lives. We called them easy targets, and they were. By 1944, they were not easy targets. They were predators. They attacked with precision. They disengaged before we could respond. They knew our tactics, all our tactics, and they had counters for everything we tried." The interviewer asked when Tanamizu had first noticed the change. "The Marianas, June 1944. I flew escort for one of Admiral Ozawa's strike waves. The Americans found us at 25,000 feet and dove through our formation like hawks through pigeons. I had never seen such coordination. Every pass was calculated. Every attack was precise. They did not waste ammunition. They did not take unnecessary risks. They killed with efficiency that suggested they had rehearsed exactly this engagement. Later, I learned that they had. Their training included mock combat against pilots flying captured Zeros. They knew our aircraft as well as we did. Better perhaps, they knew its weaknesses, while we had been taught only its strengths." Tanamizu fell silent for a moment before continuing. "I survived because I was lucky and because I had thousands of hours of experience that told me when to run. The young pilots we sent up in 1944 and 1945 had no such instincts. They had been taught to attack. They had not been taught to survive. The Americans had been taught both, and taught well. When I watched our boys die, boys with 200 hours, 150 hours, some with barely 100 hours, I knew we had lost something more than pilots. We had lost the idea that training time was what mattered. The Americans proved that training content was what mattered. They taught their pilots exactly what they needed to know, and nothing else. We taught our pilots everything, and they died before they could use any of it." The final assessment came from an unlikely source. Emperor Hirohito, in his radio address announcing Japan's surrender on August 15, 1945, spoke of the atomic bombs and the Soviet invasion as reasons for capitulation. He did not mention pilot training. But in private conversations recorded by his aides in the months that followed, the emperor returned repeatedly to the question of why Japan's air forces had failed so completely in the war's final year. In a December 1945 discussion with Prince Higashikuni, he offered an assessment that summarized everything his commanders had failed to understand. "We believed that spirit would defeat materiel. We believed that training forged in the traditions of the samurai would produce warriors that no foreign system could match. We were wrong. The Americans did not defeat us with their factories alone, though their factories were formidable. They defeated us by understanding that warriors could be made. Systematically, efficiently, in whatever numbers were required. We spent years creating each pilot. They spent months, and their months produced better pilots than our years. This was not something we imagined possible. This was not something we prepared for. We prepared for a war of spirits. They prepared for a war of systems. Systems won. Systems had won." The proof was written in the contrails over the Philippine Sea, in the burning wreckage that littered the waters around Okinawa, in the 12,000 Japanese aviators who died in the war's final year because their training had not prepared them for enemies who knew them better than they knew themselves. The samurai spirit was real, but against a system that manufactured competence the way factories manufactured aircraft, spirit was not enough. It was never going to be enough. On the morning of June 19, 1944, Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa had stood on the bridge of the carrier Taiho and watched his pilots climb into their aircraft with the pride of a father sending sons to glory. "Today we avenge Midway," he had told his staff. "The Americans believe their numbers make them invincible. They will learn that numbers are nothing against the spirit of Yamato." His chief of staff had agreed. American pilots trained for 6 months. Japanese pilots trained for 2 years. Each Japanese aviator was worth 3 Americans, perhaps more. The mathematics had seemed irrefutable. 8 hours later, 243 of Ozawa's aircraft were burning wreckage scattered across the Philippine Sea. The pilots who had climbed into those cockpits that morning, the inheritors of samurai tradition, the products of years of intensive training, the finest aviators the Imperial Navy could still field, had died in numbers that defied everything Japanese doctrine had promised. They had not been defeated by American numbers. They had been defeated by American training. The pilots who killed them were not the poorly prepared replacements that Japanese intelligence had described. They were graduates of a system that had solved a problem Japanese military culture refused to acknowledge existed: the problem of producing combat skill efficiently. The Japanese had believed that excellence required time, that there were no shortcuts to mastery, that a pilot forged in 6 months would always be inferior to a pilot forged in 2 years. They had built their entire air strategy around this assumption. They had committed their nation to a war that depended on it. The assumption was wrong. The Americans had discovered that training was not a matter of time, but of method, that the skills which mattered in combat could be identified, isolated, and transmitted with scientific precision, that a curriculum designed around enemy tactics could produce pilots who knew their opponents before ever meeting them, that simulation, standardization, and intelligence integration could compress years of experience into months of instruction. They had industrialized the production of warriors. Vice Admiral Ozawa survived the Philippine Sea. He commanded Japanese naval forces in subsequent engagements, watching his remaining pilots die in ever more lopsided battles until there were no pilots left to command. On August 15, 1945, he heard the Emperor's voice announce Japan's surrender and understood that the war he had expected to win through superior training had been lost through inferior understanding. In a post-war interview conducted by American naval historians, Ozawa was asked what lesson he drew from the defeat of Japanese naval aviation. His answer was brief. "We spent 20 years building a pilot training system based on perfection. The Americans spent 3 years building a system based on efficiency. Their system was better. We produced samurai. They produced soldiers. In modern war, soldiers win." The distinction captured everything that Japanese commanders had failed to grasp. Samurai were individuals, each one unique, each one irreplaceable, each one the product of a personal journey toward mastery that could not be duplicated or accelerated. When a samurai fell, the knowledge he carried fell with him. The training that had produced him could not be compressed. The years he had invested could not be recovered. Soldiers were products of systems, interchangeable, replaceable, each one carrying the accumulated knowledge of every soldier who had come before. When a soldier fell, another soldier took his place, equipped with the same training, the same tactics, the same institutional memory. The system learned from every death. The system grew stronger with every engagement. The system could not be defeated by killing its components, because the system simply manufactured more. Japan had built samurai. America had built a system. The system had won at the Philippine Sea. It had won at Leyte Gulf. It had won over Iwo Jima and Okinawa and the skies above Japan itself, where American pilots flew with impunity because there were no longer any Japanese pilots capable of stopping them. Lieutenant Commander Mitsuo Fuchida, the man who had led the attack on Pearl Harbor, who had shouted, "Tora, Tora, Tora," as his bombs fell on the sleeping American fleet, survived the war and converted to Christianity in its aftermath. In his memoir, published in 1951, he reflected on what the war had taught him about the nation he had attacked. "We believed the Americans were soft. We believed their factories could not produce warriors. We were correct that their factories could not produce warriors. But we did not understand that this was not what they intended. Their factories produced pilots. Their training schools produced warriors. The distinction seems meaningless. It was, in fact, everything. We asked our culture to produce excellence through tradition. They asked their culture to produce competence through method. Competence, it turned out, was enough. Competence in sufficient numbers was more than enough. We sent our spirits against their systems. The systems were stronger. The systems remained stronger. The Navy Fighter Weapons School that grew from the Fleet Air Gunnery Unit still exists today, still teaches the doctrine that was born in the desperate months of 1943, still produces pilots trained to know their enemies before meeting them. The principle that Admiral McCain and his allies established, that training is a manufacturing process, that combat skills can be systematically produced, that method matters more than time, remains the foundation of American military aviation training 8 decades later. Japan rebuilt its own training systems after the war, adopting American methods, American curricula, American philosophies. The samurai tradition that had produced the pilots of Pearl Harbor was quietly retired, replaced by standardized instruction that could produce competent aviators in months rather than years. The lesson had been learned. But for the 12,000 Japanese pilots who died in the war's final year, boys sent into the sky with inadequate training against enemies who had been specifically prepared to kill them, the lesson came too late. Vice Admiral Ozawa had promised that spirit would defeat numbers. He had not understood that numbers were irrelevant. What mattered was systems. What mattered was method. What mattered was the recognition that modern warfare rewarded efficiency over artistry, that 100 competent pilots would always defeat 50 excellent ones, that the nation which could produce skill fastest would win regardless of which nation had produced skill longest. The Americans had understood this. The Japanese had not. And in the skies over the Philippine Sea, over Leyte, over Okinawa, over the home islands themselves, the understanding had proven more powerful than any weapon, more devastating than any bomb, more final than any surrender. The samurai had trained for lifetimes to forge themselves into perfect warriors. The Americans had trained for months and learned exactly where the samurai were weakest. That knowledge, systematic, transferable, endlessly reproducible, was the weapon that won the Pacific War. And it had been built not in a factory, but in a classroom.